Welcome to Between Authors. I'm your host, author Adrian Lopez. What is it that excites us as a reader? It's finding that author or book that you may never have heard of, sort of like the treasure hunt as a reader. The goal for my podcast is to bring to you those authors or books that you may never have found, or may be the treasure you've been hunting for all along. Today in episode 49, I bring to you author Sandra Rostirolla. We're going to talk a little bit about who she is, what she's published, what she's working on, and maybe what her plans are for the future. Welcome to the show, Sandra.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Adrian. I'm excited to be here and to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited you're here as well. Why don't you begin by giving us a little introduction to yourself to the viewers?
Well, for those listening, you're probably hearing a bit of an accent. So even though I live in Los Angeles, I was born in Australia. I'm a Sydney girl from a little town called Dural, which actually means burning log in Aboriginal. I graduated uni and was recruited to come to America. My professional degree is as a physical therapist, or we're called physios in Australia. But as soon as I came stateside, I was into the acting, dancing, writing, you name it, the creativity. I just leapt at it because I felt very confined at school. I was the STEM girl, physics, chemistry, math, and that's all the teachers saw in me. And I just knew that I had more inside me that was busting to come out. So honestly, my STEM talents got me to America, but as soon as I got here, sort of put that to the wayside and focused initially on acting and dancing. Then I moved over to screenplays, and from screenplays I segued into novels. And now I'm not sure I'll ever write a screenplay again unless it is based on my novel. So that's the short little synopsis of my life.
Yeah, and then it's interesting again because I like to talk a lot on the podcast about an author's voice, right? And every author needs to find what their voice is, and your voice really comes from your experiences, things that you've done in your life, your likes, right? Your influences. And that kind of builds every author's voice, which is always unique, right? And that's why there doesn't need to be competition, because there's no two authors' voice that are the same, because your experiences, your challenges, your growth, everything's different, right? So your voice is always going to be different. But it's interesting. I know we had talked before. You had sent me a copy of your book, and you originally lived like 2 blocks away from me, from where I live now, which I really thought was interesting.
Yes, that's right. So crazy. Such a small world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little, giving the viewers a little more kind of a introduction to you. Why don't you talk a little bit about what influences you, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be authors and books. Like you said, it could be movies, it could be music, it could be art.
Sure. Well, the first book I ever wrote is a fantasy adventure, a YA fantasy adventure called Cecilia, the Last Cruelty, which ultimately turned into a trilogy. And I got to say, I actually never saw myself as a fantasy writer. It was my husband that gave me the impetus to even go down that route. Prior to that, I had written a couple of romantic comedy screenplays. And I don't think romantic comedy actually is my shtick. I love watching them, but I really think I'm definitely more of a fantasy and a drama writer. And the reason I went into fantasy is he wanted to do a ballet. He's a composer. Mm-hmm. And I offered to write the ballet story, but the story that he wanted to compose was going to be this big, fantastical story. And I was okay at the ballet story end because you don't have to go into too much detail. You just say the goddess of light is dying, and here's Cecilia. She's growing up in this forest inside Plockton. You don't have to go into a lot of detail.
Yep.
But halfway through writing the ballet story, my husband turned around and he got too busy and he couldn't do the ballet anymore. And I had done all this research and put all this stuff together, and I sort of thought, well, what am I going to do with all of this? And he was the one that said, well, why don't you write the book And I even said to him, I said, no, I said, to write the book, I've got to go way in depth about the fantasy. I need to know the mythology. I need to know how, just the whole world. And I even said, no, that's not me. I can't do that. And it's so awful. It's so awful that we do that to ourselves, that we box ourselves in and just feel that, I don't know, I got to love my husband because he was the one that gave me the permission to push myself. Yeah. And I got to say, I love fantasy. I love fantasy. In between wrapping up Cecilia, I did jump in and do my current book, this one here, which is a YA coming of age. But that book came about purely because that was a story that found me. I did not go looking for this story. It's a personal story that is really inspired by my childhood and my life of having suicide in my family, with my dad who died by suicide when I was 13. And I just was driven to write this story to help open up the conversation about depression, suicide for a younger audience. I mean, my protagonist is a 12-year-old, and I wanted to come up with a language that would be simple and easy to understand for kids and parents. Hence why it's called Making Friends with Monsters, and I'm equating our negative emotions, our sort of darker side to monsters. But outside of that, I mean, the current series I'm now working on is back to fantasy again. I've really become the fantasy gal, and I'm quite surprised at how much I've embraced the world of fantasy. And I'm sorry, Adrian, how did I even go down this path? What was the question again?
No, I mean, honestly, everything you said is very interesting, right? And they're all good points. The question was really influences, right? What really influences you? But all of that was great.
It was my husband, right, for fantasy. And then the second influence for the new book, Making Friends with Monsters, literally my life, my personal experience, and wanting to use the pain and the struggles and the learning that I had to go through and giving that to others so that people can learn from my experiences. That was something that I just wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I really enjoyed everything you were saying, because there's a lot of good points that you were making in there. And really, the biggest one is how you mentioned that, everybody always, a lot of times, holds yourself back, right? You hold yourself back by thinking, I could never do that. I can't do that. There's no way I could do that, right? You start giving all the negative feedback to yourself that you just can't. So you won't, right? Because you've already talked yourself into it's not possible. Mm-hmm. But the beauty of it is when you take yourself out of that comfort zone, right? When you take yourself away from what you normally do or normally know, that is when you always have the biggest amount of growth, right? That is when you grow beyond anything you could have imagined, right? And you find out more about yourself than you even knew. Like you said, I love fantasy, right? I didn't even think about this, but I absolutely love it. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens when you are willing to make yourself vulnerable, to take that step out of that comfort zone and take the chance. And I always think it's a beautiful thing for that reason, right? Because you find out so much more about yourself, and then the growth that usually comes from it. It's a beautiful thing.
It's so true, Adrian. We're our worst critics. We put ourselves in a box. And the funny thing is, I mean, a lot of people say for Making Friends with Monsters, because it's lots of themes with mental health and everything, they'll call me brave for doing that. But honestly, I consider myself brave for going down the fantasy path. That to me was more of a struggle, more of a fear, more of a world I didn't feel that maybe I belonged in. Yeah. I see fantasies. I love fantasy. I love watching fantasy, but I wouldn't call myself a super fantasy freak. Is that bad to say that? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not a Comic-Con. I can't do the big crowd. So I'm not immersed in that world of doing cosplay and everything. And I always thought, gosh, to go into fantasy, you sort of needed to be that person. You know, you needed to be a particular way. And that was all my own baggage. I said, who said that? I said that. No one else said that. And I put all those barriers, probably because I had fears. And so you sort of give yourself these barriers as a way to not face your fears, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But that was a way harder journey than writing something that I knew. And I knew mental health struggles. I knew dysfunction in a family. I knew about lies and secrets and the generational trauma of having lies and secrets and families not being open and honest with each other.
Yeah.
So that wasn't hard for me to write, and it wasn't scary for me to write. And I love that people call me brave for writing that, but I didn't feel brave for doing that. Isn't that also strange? I feel brave stepping into fantasy.
And it makes complete sense, right? Because again, you know, the experiences you had, right? And they are traumatic, right? They do, you know, mold you in a way because you grow from it, the challenges, the obstacles. But when that is happening, as sometimes as terrible or as difficult they are, you're in the situation, right? It's not about being brave. You're already in it, right? You're in it and suffering or working your way through it. So I can see where you're saying that, because the other one, you had to make a conscious effort to say, I'm doing this, right? And you understand both sides of it, of why you would say that's a braver thing to do. But it also goes back to, you know, you being willing to write that right from your experiences, right from the emotions, right? It is a brave thing as well, because, you know, reliving sometimes those emotions, or working through those emotions that you may never or hadn't worked through in the past, is also very difficult, right? To take that step. But the beauty of it is kind of like you mentioned, is there's so many things in life in general people don't talk about, right? They don't talk about it. Everybody wants to, well, they know, you know, they know what it is, but they don't talk about it, right? And mental health is always one of them. Mental health is something, you know, that's in families, it's in you know, close relationships, and people don't talk about it. It's just never discussed, right? That was the reason I started writing, is because I wrote, you know, my children's book dedicated to my daughter, because my wife and I lost her during pregnancy after years of fertility struggles. And it's the same thing. I talk about it. Is it the easiest thing to talk about? No. But I talk about it for that reason, because there's a lot of people that don't, right? They don't feel comfortable yet talking about it. So, you know, kind of like you said, you hope that people can see that, know that they're not alone. They're not the only ones going through that, and you can get through it, right? Is it easy? No, it's not easy, right? There's so much that goes along with that, but it is something that you can get through, and it helps when you hear others that have gone through it, or others that have had the same thing. Because too many people, again, they don't talk about it, and sometimes they feel, why is this happening to me? Why am I dealing with it? And most of these issues, unfortunately, are much more wide range than people really realize.
Absolutely. I mean, especially suicide. I think the conversation is getting better, definitely. Yeah. My dad, we were brought up Roman Catholic. My dad's Italian. My last name, even though I'm married, I kept my maiden name, so I'm half Italian, Rostirolla. And in the Catholic Church, that's even, you know, suicide is just even more taboo. So you add that on top of just in general in society, it was very taboo. No one, you think that you're alone, you think that you're the only one that's got suicide in your family, because no one talks about it. But then when you talk about it, you realize it is the secret that's inside a lot of families. There's a lot of families out there where so-and-so died of a heart attack. That was the story in my family. I didn't realize. I was over here in America. I left Australia when I was about 22. And I didn't realize that the conversation for the next generation, my nieces and nephews, was Nono died of a heart attack. I'm like, wow. But that's the story that many, many, many fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, families died of an accident, but it was because it was suicide. Yeah. And it's only when you start the conversation that other people start to feel comfortable to say, yeah, they've had suicide in their family too. And the amount of people I've run into, the amount of people that have suicide in their family is huge. But growing up, I felt like I was so unique that I was the only one within like 1,000-mile radius that would have something crazy like this happen, because no one else did, but they really did. You know what I mean? It's just that no one was talking about it. So
it's and and the problem is, unfortunately, when you don't talk about it, right, when you don't bring it up, and when, like you said, the next generations don't know about it, then that's why a lot of this stuff keep happening, because people don't even know. So when it starts happening to them and they have these feelings or thoughts, they think it's them, right? They think it's just me. They don't understand how wide range it is. And the conversation's the best thing about it for that reason. So people understand, like younger generations, when they start having those feelings or having those thoughts, they would at least understand maybe where it's headed, right? Or what they're feeling. Where when you don't have those conversations, you don't, right? They don't even know kind of what's going on or why they're feeling that or thinking that way. So the conversation, again, not the easiest, but it is the best thing usually to come out of a lot of these situations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and again, going back to your point about taking the chance and doing fantasy, the biggest piece of advice I would always give is, regret is always so much worse than failing, right? You failing, you can try again and attempt it. Regret, you can't, because if you're regretting something, that opportunity's gone, right? You've already lost that opportunity. It's not worth it, right? Take the chance. It doesn't. Failing is not the end all, right? It doesn't mean anything. You just try again. You do it something else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would definitely say that's something that, thankful is that kind of the word. Even though I'm terrified 99.9% of the time, I will forge through and I will try new things and I will do new things, even if it does mean failure. I'm not 100% sure where that comes from, but because I'm that same way, I don't want to live with regret. I don't want to feel regretful about just thinking, oh, I can't do that, or that's not for me, that's other people should do stuff like that, but I should be over here. Hence the whole, yes, I knew the teachers were seeing me as this physics, chemistry, math gal, and I just wasn't willing to just stay in that realm because I knew it wasn't making me happy. But it is scary. It is really, really scary, to the point where I became a licensed therapist. I gave up my license, and I remember telling my then best friend in Australia, I was in America, and I told her how I left the profession and I'd let my license lapse, and like there was silence on the phone. Silence. And then she's like, but you can still come back to Australia and get your license back, correct? Like, it was so foreign for her. It was so foreign for her to think that I went to university, did this 4-year degree, this specific profession that requires a license, and I just walked away from it. And that was very, very foreign. And that felt like, especially when I grew up, that felt like the prevailing mindset, at least in my circle. I mean, the entertainment industry isn't huge in Australia, certainly is getting bigger, but the mindset typically was, this is what you're studying, this is what you're going to do, you're going to just, white picket fence, 2.5 kids, that whole thing. And breaking away from that, especially for me, I mean, my dad's blue collar. He was a builder. Mum was a stay-at-home mum. There was no follow your dream. What dream? You don't have dreams. You get up, you go to work, you have kids, all that kind of stuff. And I needed to follow my dreams.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, it's again, when you honor your heart and soul, right, what they're asking you to do,
mhm.
it's a good thing, right? It leads to you being fulfilled, right? It leads to you being, you're nourishing your soul and what your true calling is, right? That was really what you wanted to do. And again, if you had ignored that and stayed, with your license doing that,
Oh,
you know,
I I
thinking back, you probably would have been miserable, right?
I was miserable, Adrian. I
Yeah.
remember I got to the point where I woke up one day and I went, I'm wishing my life away.
Yeah.
Come Monday morning, I'd wake up going, I wish it was Friday, wish it was Friday, wish it was Friday. I'm like, that's so bad. I'm
Yeah.
literally wishing my life away. The only time I felt good and relaxed was Friday night and then Saturday. But then Saturday night would come and I'd start to feel sick because I'm like, I've only got one more day before I have
Yeah.
to go. Like, that was my life.
Yeah.
And I just went, this is not right. I can't continue living that way. I was making good money. I ended up getting an MBA. I was working in a hospital. The hospital paid pretty much for my MBA as long as I got A's. I got something like 80% of the MBA paid back. So to get my MBA cost me like about, it was pennies, of $3,000 or something. But I climbed the corporate ladder at the hospital, I was earning good money, but I was spending that money because I wasn't happy. Every weekend, my husband and I, we'd go away and I was just so flippant with the money because, again, I wasn't happy. I was just trying to buy my happiness. Becoming a writer, the paycheck definitely took a bit of a dive. I wasn't earning six figures anymore, that's for sure. But boy, was my fulfillment
Yeah.
huge, and the need to have as much money wasn't there because I didn't need to buy happiness. If that does
Yeah.
that make sense? So
Yeah. Yeah.
it sort of all comes out in the wash a little bit. But no, I just remember I was immensely miserable, immensely miserable.
Yeah, it's that's one of the biggest reasons I do this, right? I do the podcast. That's one of the biggest reasons I try to share everybody, all the other authors' works out there when I can, putting it out there because, for all of us, every one of us that writes, it's passion projects, right? They're passion works because very few, if any, are making enough money to pay the bills doing the writing, right?
Right,
You
exactly.
all have to do usually something else to be able to pay all your normal requirements to live.
Mm,
And you know, you're hoping that the books at least kind of pay for themselves or pay for the next one, for the editing or something. You're kind of
yeah.
hoping it carries itself through. But that's the thing. I know how much every author puts their heart and soul into these books, right? And how much it means to them. So I will always try to share everybody's work out there to get eyes in it for that reason. Because I know myself personally how hard it is to do and how much you put into the work, right? So
Mm.
that's why I always do this because again, most of us are not making anything from the book to really do anything else.
No, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
You
Um,
definitely got to look. It's like any part of the entertainment industry is what I say, be it, writing, directing, acting, any of that. If you're going in it for the money and fame, you're going in it for the wrong reason. The love
yeah.
has to be for the art first. It has to be for creating something. And if that love's not there, you're gonna be miserable as well. You're gonna
Yeah.
be just miserable as I was working in the corporate world because you're constantly chasing something instead of living in the moment and being happy with what you're creating. So yeah, you can't chase the money in this industry because you'll be miserable.
Yeah. I mean, and not only that, if you're doing something you don't love, right?
Mhm.
Art, any kind of art, doesn't matter, writing, music, acting, any of it.
Mhm.
If you're not into it, right? If it's not something you truly love and want to do, it'll be felt, right? So
Yeah.
readers will feel no connection to anything you're writing, right? Because there is no connection. You haven't even put a connection yourself. With the
Right.
music, same thing, right? The actors, and there's always a lot of talk about AI and stuff. And
Oh,
that's the one thing that's always missing from these things. Sure, they can write an amazing story, right? That people can follow along, but there's always not going to be that, and it's cliche to say, but it's not going to have that soul in it
mhm.
because, right, there's no connection from the AI generated system creating this, and it's just like it's just like somebody going through the motions, and it could be a great piece of work, right, or great outcome, but it's not going to have that connection. It's not there because it's when the writer puts it in, when the singer's putting that emotion when they're singing the song, when the actor really puts it behind it when they're in the scene.
Yeah.
That's when the audience, no matter what it is, reading, hearing, or seeing, when that connection's there is when that's the magic, right? That's when it happens.
Mhm.
And if you aren't loving it and you're doing it for the money, you're not going to get that money because it's not going to be there, right? There is no connection. There's nobody gonna to really connect to what you're trying to do.
Very true. Very, very true, Adrian. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about it, but why don't you give a little more of a summary about what your book's about? Um, and again, don't only go as deep as you would like. I don't want you giving anything away in the story.
Sure. Yeah, Making Friends with Monsters, at its core, it's a story about lies. And so, and I only just figured this out with my producer. It's so funny how I've had this story for a year, and he was the one that really helped me boil it down. That ultimately it's about lies, and it's about 12-year-old Sam who sets off on this fact-finding mission to find out about these monsters that he sees in his family. And he figures out the hard way that every family has secrets, and these secrets have a way of coming out.
Yeah,
And that's the core of it. And meshed in with all of this is ultimately themes of mental health, themes of suicide. Ultimately, Sam is just worried about his 17-year-old older brother who's just done a complete 180 on the family. And no, Sam's like, well, what's wrong with Ben? And his mum says, oh, it's fine. Ben's just going through a teenage phase. But Sam doesn't believe his mum. Sam says, no, Ben's got a monster. And that's how he rationalizes why his brother's changed. And Sam figures, well, if I can find out everything I can about these beasts, maybe I can help Ben. And it's only when Sam has a really terrible accident, and he has this accident because of a knock-on effect, because of Ben being the way he is. Ben doesn't do what he's supposed to do, so Sam has to go and do this thing. Sam ends up having a bad accident, and this accident brings out Sam's own monster. And that's when Sam starts to understand his older brother. And Sam's like, you know what? These monsters are addictive, and I kind of like having this monster. Sam realizes he likes being angry. Anger is a good emotion. It's an easy emotion. It's the easiest emotion to jump to. When you're angry, it releases endorphins. You kind of feel good because you get everything out. And yeah, but ultimately, Sam has he gets taken under his wing by this biker, and this biker has the same injury as what Sam has, same disability, and there's a lot of tough love there. And I love that aspect of the story. I mean, that's probably my most favorite aspect of this story. This little 12-year-old, wide-eyed, kind of innocent boy, and this kind of emotionally disconnected biker, but who sees this young boy and doesn't want this young boy going down the same path, doesn't want him getting tattoos and becoming a biker and doing all that. So he really wants to help her and save this boy, but it's this boy that, without Cliff realizing, saves Cliff. And the biker ends up being a better man because of this this boy that comes into his life. And that to me, I just love that relationship so
Yeah.
much. But yeah, that's sort of what my story is about. It's called Making Friends with Monsters. So there's no secret that at the end, Sam does figure out how he makes friends with his inner demon. So, and if you want to know how, you just buy the book and read it.
You may have already talked about it, but I always like to ask, is there a favorite scene?
Oh,
It
yeah.
does it can be a scene, but that was a good point of that whole relationship being the favorite part of the book. So that
Oh,
was a good thing.
that as a moment, yes, because that sort of drags on. It's just they're great moments because Sam just asks a million and one questions, and it's like, and Cliff's not used to this. He's getting bombarded and peeling the layer off Cliff. But in regards to my favorite scene, and this is just me, this is a writer, you fall in love with your moments and your characters. But Sam has a younger sister, Abby, and Abby is 6. And this story is set during the millennial drought, which pretty much happened from 2000 to 2006, 2007 in Australia. And it was devastating, like one of the worst droughts we'd ever had. And I've set this family as a farming family, sheep farm in Australia. So there's this external pressure already that's happening on the family, which is partially playing a little bit into Ben's issues or not. But anyway, the premise is Abby, who's 6, she was born in 2000. She's never seen a rainbow. She's never experienced rain or anything like that. And the story does end. I don't think this is a giveaway. There ends up being a break, and it does rain at the end. And I don't know, every time I read this scene, it always just warms my heart because the morning starts with Abby screaming. She's screaming and no one knows what's going on. And Sam runs into the bedroom, the dad runs into the bedroom, and they're like, what's wrong with Abby? And then Sam says, and then I realize Abby's not scared, she's ecstatic. And she jumps off the bed, she runs outside. Sam follows her and he's like, and now I know why. And arcing across the sky is a big rainbow. And like every time I read that, I get myself teary because this little girl who's never seen a rainbow before just being so ecstatic about this rainbow. And sorry, but that is still my favorite scene, no matter what. I love it.
It sounds like a great scene, though. I mean, you can understand that because there is, so many people that have been born in times where they don't know certain things, right? They've never experienced it, they haven't seen them, and you can understand where that excitement would come when you do see that for the first time, right? Somebody who's never been in snow finally goes somewhere where there's snow,
Yeah.
right? The excitement that you see in people's faces, it's real, right? Because you're like, I've never experienced this. I mean, so you understand that emotion, but again, the best part of that, right? And I love how you're saying how that always affects you when you reread it. But that again, that's the beauty. That's the connection that reader is going to feel, right? Because you're feeling it. If you're feeling it, then they're going to feel it when they're reading it.
Yeah, that's the hope. Oh, lost you for a second.
Yeah, it's I think it's the rain outside because we're both here in LA, so it's the rain.
It's not too bad here on the east side, but it's a little bit sprinkly. Must be worse out where you are. Yeah.
Yeah, it's loud. I was hoping it's not picking up on the mic, but
I'm not hearing anything. No.
Yeah, it's loud outside. So I like to ask on the other side, right? And again, I know this book is from experiences from childhood, traumas or challenges. Is there a scene in the book that was hard, right? And it could be from emotions or memory, or was there a scene that was just difficult to come together?
Yes, there absolutely was. I will preface and say that emotionally, there wasn't anything that was difficult for me to write. Excuse the pun. I've pretty much always been an open book. My friends, everyone I've met that gets to know me, I've never hidden my past at all. So I've never been ashamed of it, and I've never been shy to talk about it. So the emotions They were pretty much all fine to write. The scene that I found the hardest to write, because I really wanted to make sure it had impact, is the scene where Sam has his accident. And it's a farming accident that he has. And just having to set the scene up with the fact that there's this tractor, and this tractor is driving this other feed wagon, and there's an auger, and that there's this other spinning pipe that, see, I'm not doing it well now. I ended up doing it really well in the book, is trying to paint this whole scene without saying the word tractor, because there's two tractors. So you've got to be careful you're not saying tractor, tractor, tractor 100 times. And then setting the scene up visually so that the audience doesn't really know what's going to happen, and that it becomes shocking for the reader. That I really wanted that, what just happened? And especially at the end, this part I don't want to give too much away, but the accident that Sam has, it's quite traumatic, and it took a long time. It took a long time to write this scene and to make it engaging, to make it impactful, to make it emotional, and to also be like, what? Like at the end, to just have what did that author just do to me? Like, I really wanted to have that moment, and I've had feedback that I think I managed to do that with that scene, but it was challenging. Like, I read it now. The funny thing is, I read it now, I'm like, why did I struggle with this scene so much?
Yeah.
It seems easy enough, but that's because, like, the simplest things, like when an author writes something that kind of is sort of simple, usually that's the hardest thing to do. Do you know does that make sense, Adrian? Like, I made it look easy for myself, if that makes sense, but boy, it was a challenge.
Well, and it's interesting because it goes back to, as the author, the characters, the story, it's all kind of, it's your baby, right? The characters are like your children as you're writing them. And, as you start getting attached to these characters and in their story, in their emotions, and you come up on a scene where you're going to give them a traumatic, situation, you would understand that challenge, right? Because it's almost like you're leading them to it. You're basically like, I'm sorry, but I'm taking you over here to do this, and I know it's going to change everything, but I got to get it done. So you can understand how maybe subconsciously it's difficult, because you're almost fighting yourself. And it would be like, again, because it's like being the reader. If you're reading this and you feel that tension build, and you're like, well, wait a minute, is something about to happen? It's the same when you're writing it, right? You're feeling that yourself, because you know what the outcome's going to be, but subconsciously you might be saying, I really don't want this to happen. I don't want this character to have to go through this, but I need to, right? I need to push it through.
I think I'm a little bit mean that way. I was well aware that my character had to. Look, here's the thing. Sam is the sweetest kid, full of innocence, and I knew I needed to do something significant to him for his monster to come out. That much I knew. It couldn't be something small. It just couldn't. He just isn't one of those characters, one of those kids that something mean happening to him would bring out his monster. He needed to go through this. I think for me, the biggest thing definitely was a lot of it was actually more technical, of understanding how I wanted to give it to the reader with Sam blacking out, and how do I bring him out of that blackout? What do I visually tell the reader so that they can understand how things were moving molasses for him, all that kind of stuff, like painting that sort of weird, that world for a reader to be in Sam's head, because it's all first person present, you're inside Sam, and having them actually feel what it's like to be knocked out for a little bit, and to sort of come out of this being knocked out, all of that is just trying to take that and give it words, and give the appropriate words, was definitely a struggle. But then also being well aware of what I was doing to my reader.
Yeah.
Well aware that I knew that some readers were just, because up until that point, Sam had other things that he thought, that he was going through enough with his family and everything. And I just knew the reader was going to go, you know, and I kind of wanted to do that. I did. I know it's a bit naughty, but that's what we do, right? We want to put our readers on a journey, and yeah, but I know that I don't feel bad for doing what I did to Sam. Sorry.
You can't, right?
It's awful. I know.
I mean, I understand completely because I'm writing my zombie book right now, right? And you know, there's characters you're writing and building, and you're purposely want the readers connect. But I was like, he's not going to make it, right?
Right. I know.
He's not coming out of this. Sorry.
You talk about having a God complex. Us authors, right? That's when we play God. We decide who lives or dies. And
pretty much.
Yeah.
So this may lead into the other question, because I always like to ask if you did any research. So was your research more on the equipment, and like you said, if you had a concussion, if you got knocked out, what that feeling would be?
Oh, absolutely. My research is extensive inside Safari, where you can have folders and favorites and everything. I actually looked at it the other day and I was like, oh my gosh, I did so much research. I bookmark all the websites I'd go to. Everything would be bookmarked. I did so much research about the drought, everything that the farmers were going through, all the different accidents that they would have. I mean, like little things that just would break my heart. But there was one story I read where one of the farmers basically just said goodbye to everyone, made plans. Yes, I'm going to be at so-and-so's next week, knowing full well he was not going to be at so-and-so's next week. He left and he took his life. And like all these little things, and how back then that the farmers did depression. I'm not depressed. Hearing about farming wives taking the medication and crushing it up in mashed potatoes for their husband to take. Like all these stories. I mean, Adrian, honestly, there was this thing I came across where I just went, oh my gosh, this has to go into my book. There's a company called Exit International. Have you heard of them by any chance? Not a lot of people have. So. Exit International is a company in Australia that basically came up with this recipe for a suicide pill. And they went out to a farm in New South Wales, sort of out the back of nowhere. They invited all these aged and infirmed, and they gave them the recipes and the supplies to brew up their own suicide pill. And I'm doing all this research, and come to find out, I mean, as authors, you want to research as much as you can. I started to get these notices saying it is illegal. Like what I was doing was actually illegal. I could have been charged with a crime for trying to research this, but you don't really mean to, but you want to know as much as possible, because I'm like, I need to kind of know the formula of that, because if I know the formula a little bit, then how can I hide it and turn it into something like for my storytelling and everything. But I had no idea that I was going down this path, that the Australian government had locked it all down and it's completely illegal and dangerous. And I get all these warning sites on these websites I'd go to. Oh gosh. So yes, I did a ton of research. I did a ton of research with the injury that Sam has, and the same injury that the biker has, Cliff. Did a ton of research about that to make sure I understood. And that's where having the background of being a physical therapist comes into play, because there was a lot of things that was easy for me to understand, anatomically and all that medical jargon that was very easy for me to digest and comprehend. And I think they were the biggest areas I did my research on. But the funny thing is that what I get asked a lot from psychologists and social workers, they ask me, what kind of research did I do on the other aspect, the emotional aspect, and the facts? Like Sam goes on these little fact-finding missions, and mission, and he collects these little post-it notes. He starts writing these little post-it notes about monsters, like fact number 1 about monsters. Most people don't know they exist. Fact number 2, we all have one. Fact number 3, if you let them get too hungry, they'll swallow you whole. And on he goes. And these social workers, and they're like, some of these facts, they're very insightful. They're very insightful of what you came up with. Where did you do the research for that? And that was where I just had to say, that was all me. That was life. Life was my research for that.
You lived it, right?
Yeah, I lived it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to have like a best-selling author tag, but you should use the only author on the Australian government watch list.
Oh my! Well, I'm not sure if I'm on the watch list, but boy, I know it's crazy. My author friends and I, we laugh about that. Or even some of my writer friends that are screenwriters, you're like, I don't want anyone to look at my Google history. If they look at my Google history, they'll think I'm a crazed psycho, But getting back to doing research, we sort of had a chat at the beginning, and you said you wanted any young writers to know about that aspect.
Yeah,
it's so important. I wish I could remember who I did the masterclass with. Who's that prolific writer? Oh my gosh, he puts out like 20 books a year. I can't think, but I did his masterclass, and he said that someone asked him about that. They said, oh, well, let's just say I'm writing a story and there's a bomb on the plane. Do I have to know much about the bomb? And he said, yeah, you do. You do. And I agree. That's why I was so diligent about trying to find out as much as I could about this, at least the chemical composition of the suicide pill, so that I can bring it into the story in another way. You do have to do your research. It's really important. You don't need to bring your research into your story, like regurgitating all the detail, but it just gives you this really strong foundation, and it just makes your world feel rich and rounded and real. Did not mean to do an alliteration then, but I guess I did. And I just can't.
Always remember the triple R's.
Yeah, rich, rounded, and real. Research. There you go. Research.
There you go.
Oh my gosh, rich, rounded, and real. I'm gonna. What do they call that? Will you trademark that?
Copyright.
Copyright. Yeah. I cannot preface how important that is. There's again, I'm just telling you what my readers will tell me, and it does make me feel good about this, but I do get feedback saying that everything just felt so authentic, so real, and that's what you want from your readers. And I have to think that a lot of it is because, sure, okay, I lived the emotional experience, but all the research I did on the drought, all the research I did on the emotional pressure that was happening to the farmers back then, and all the research I did on the injury that my character has, all of that comes into play, and you can't just skirt along the top. You really can't, because you'll be amazed that your research, it might just be one little aspect, but that aspect is a dialogue that you might put into another character's mouth.
Yep.
Right? It all of a sudden it legitimizes everything, and it just is so important.
Yeah, it is one of the most important things, and it's, and when you talk about that, it doesn't have to be the rabbit hole, right? It doesn't have to be hours and hours and hours of research, but it has to be specific research to like you said, to make sure that comes off as real, make sure it's understood, because it's almost 100% guaranteed that the reader that does know you don't know what you're talking about will read your book.
Exactly.
And unfortunately what happens is it just takes them out of the book. It takes them out of the moment, because you lose credibility for one, but for another, somebody goes, wait a minute, that's not how it would work. They're out of it, right? They're just out of that story. It's just they've already lost everything that you had worked to build to that point. It's gone, right? So that story, no matter how great your story is, it's lost, right? They're not going to come back to where you had them. You're never going to get that point back.
pulling a reader out is, I don't want to say death, but boy, yeah, getting pulled out of a story. I will go back to your point where you said it doesn't have to be hours and hours of research. Well, probably because I've got a science background. I do actually have a Bachelor of Applied Science, and I actually love the research. I do spend hours and hours and hours. I just feel like it's got to gather information, and then I go through the synthesizing process, because all of that kind of drives my story and helps me. So for me, even in my fantasies, it is still hours and hours and hours of research, because I'm not a person who can just build a world out of thin air. I'll call it cheating. I don't care. I scour the internet, be it lands like Iceland or Greenland or something that's going to give me some kind of concept of what a landscape might look like. And I print all these pictures out and I throw them up on my wall. I've got a big wall in front of me here. And that's how I'm able to describe something. Like if it's an ice cave.
Yeah.
Yes, I can picture an ice cave in my head, but it's not the same as having an ice cave in front of me and seeing, oh my gosh, it's actually blue. Yeah. It's blue. That water looks blue. And it just gives me, it just makes it easier for me to describe, if that makes sense. And so I rely on real world images out there to drive my description of my world. So even in that regard, I'm doing a lot of research to make sure I've got a comprehensive visual world for the world building of my fantasies.
Yeah, but it goes to the author, right? So a lot of us, yes, that's how we are, right? We love information, we love knowledge. You know, I almost watch every darn documentary that comes on, even if I wasn't interested in the documentary itself, what it was about, I'll wind up watching it because, like, okay, that was interesting. I never even thought about that or knew that. Mm-hmm. Same thing when you're doing research, you start going down and you're like, oh, and then that takes you somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
So I understand what you're saying, but there's a lot of people, writers, that probably aren't to that level, that don't want that, right? So I always want them to understand, you got to at least make the effort. If you're talking, like you're saying, if you're talking about a bomb, at least know how it would be built, how it's going to explode, what it's going to do, where it needs to be put. Don't just make it up, right? Don't just say, oh, I saw in a movie that it was in a briefcase under a sea. Well, but what was it? what was it going to do? Is it just going to explode that seed? Is it going to put a hole in the wall? What is it doing? Right? So you have to make the effort. You got to make some effort to at least give that to the story. You can't be lazy and just say there's a bomb under seed, exploded, everybody died. Okay, now this happens.
Yeah, I think the only time I was watching the behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings, just love, and like every year it is the Lord of the Rings trilogy that gets watched and all the behind the scenes. I'm like, oh, what joy that must have been. So when they were writing the screenplay, is it Pippa and Peter Jackson's wife were talking about that they'd come to the moments of the fight scenes. And look, as writers, we can't just say, they fight. We have to sort of, we've got to sort of paint the fight scene. Yeah. And I had to do that in my fantasy trilogy. But they're like, oh, yeah, no, once we got to there, we just wrote in the screenplay they fight. Knowing full well that Peter Jackson and his stunt coordinators and all that would then build out this 10-minute kind of fight scene. I'm like, oh, they're so lucky. They were able to just write, they fight. They had this whole other contingency behind them. We don't have that luxury as authors to just write these things.
I mean, it would be nice, right? You type in your manuscript, they fight, you save it, and you come back the next day, and there's a whole fight scene. You're like, hey, this is great.
Maybe we can type that into a chat GTP. Write a fight scene for me.
So I know you've talked about you're writing the screenplay. You're trying to turn your book into a movie.
Yes.
So essentially, I usually ask, "What are you working on right now?" That is technically what you're working on.
That's taking a lot of my focus. I've written the screenplay. So I am thankful that I do have experience in writing screenplays and doing the adaptation. Look, it's definitely challenging because the structure of a book is, we can have a little bit more leeway with our structure, even though we talk about act 1, act 2, act 3, blah, blah, blah. It is more defined when it comes to a film, especially when you've got to wrap things up in the end. I could take more breathing room and use more characters in a book, but it's definitely was challenging to get it all down and condense it. I just finished doing the pitch deck for it, which is a whole other thing as well. That's very much for anyone that wants to know. A pitch deck is a visual sort of palette of what the story could be. And you don't want to have a lot of writing in a pitch deck. And that's tough because now you've got to take your, what is my 115-page screen? First of all, you take a 330-page book and boil it down to a 115-page screenplay. Then you've got to take this 115-page screenplay and boil it down to maybe 5 pages, and each page just have 1 or 2 lines on it. And it's like, wow, that is a challenge to do that, and then attaching the visuals to it. But really what you want with the pitch deck is just for other people, other producers, directors, or anyone else, investors, to kind of look at it and not have to read too much and get an emotion, get a feeling, to be like, oh, this is the world we're in, this is the story that we're in, these are the comparable films, and this is how much these films cost, and this is how much they made, and different things like that. That was challenging. But ultimately, I am supposed to be getting back to my fantasy, my new fantasy that I've started writing, and I'm about 5 chapters in. It's just been such a slow slog getting that done. Yeah. Not because it's hard. I mean, I want to do it. It's just finding the time. And I had, last year was a medical nightmare. You know about this. I had a tumor in my right ear and had to have surgery on that. And 6 months later, I had to have a revision surgery, which was just a few weeks ago in January. Yeah. And, you know, coming out of surgery, it takes me a long time to recover. It just throws you completely. So I really want to get back to getting that fantasy out, because it'll be, come April, it'll be a year since my book, Making Friends with Monsters, was published. And I don't have anything else to publish. You got to keep feeding the beast, right, Adrian?
You have to, I know.
You got to keep feeding into the system.
Yeah. You know, it's a great point. It's a great point you make about the screenplays and the differences, right? The differences between a book and a screenplay, because a lot of people don't understand that difference, right? The transformation that has to go through. And I bring that up because, you know, my background is horror movies, right? I love horror movies, and you know, at my age, I've seen all the old Universals. I saw the Hammer versions in the 70s. I've seen all the new stuff, right? So thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of horror movies, right? And it's a big influence for me. And somebody had mentioned that when they read my werewolf book, that they go, okay, I understand now how much horror movies have influenced you, because your book's written like a movie, right? And when I write, I do picture it. It's like I'm dictating a movie I'm watching, is how kind of I write. So they said, I understand that now. Your book is almost like watching the movie. Your transitions, everything is like going through a movie. Mm-hmm. But I know that doesn't mean that easily translates into a screenplay, right? It just doesn't. It's a completely different animal in itself, as like you said, different type of pitch deck that you have to do, different type of structure, different type of writing style, right? You can't just translate it across. So I'm really happy you brought that up, because, you know, again, some writers may not understand. I really think I can take this book and just easily transition it over. It doesn't work that way.
It's not, even if you have like a very visual story and one that's very linear, right? You're not dealing with timelines or time jumps or anything. You've got, especially with Making Friends with Monsters, first person, present. So Sam's got a lot of monologues, and Sam talks to the reader a lot. You know, like, we know Sam's thoughts. How do you get thoughts on into a film. I've had to use voiceover. There was no way I could do it without voiceover. Then you've got to be so careful with voiceover. Voiceover is its own thing. You've got to be very careful that you're using it either sparingly or that you're not being redundant with it. Or if you are being redundant with it, sometimes it works really well. Sometimes it's great to show the visuals, but then the voiceover also talking about the visuals, as long as you're doing it and you know why you're doing it, not doing it as a mistake. There are a lot of screenplays I've read where I'm like, why are they being so redundant with this voiceover? The visuals are showing us what we need to know. You're being very redundant. And that was a whole thing I had to tread across. And I always used to wonder I'd hear about adaptations and I'd hear writers talk about how they would take a couple of characters and combine them. And I always used to think, why? But then you do understand. It's like you don't want to, for either monetary reasons or just from a plain storytelling, you want a character to stay in the story longer, where in a book, it can work. You can have this character and then you can have that character. But in a film, you realize it doesn't work, because every time you bring a character in, you've got to define them. You really need to make sure that they connect with the audience when I'm talking about film. Whereas in a book, you can write like a little bit of backstory about them. You can make the reader connect in other ways, but you can't do that in a film. No. So you can't spend all this time developing a character. So that's why you get a couple of characters. And I have to do that,
otherwise, your books are, your movies, 6-hour long miniseries, right? Or you got like 2 or 3 intermissions and you're sitting in a theater for 6 hours. You can't do it. You just can't do it.
Realizing I had to cut out one complete character completely, and she had a lot of information. And so I'm like, what am I going to do? How am I going to fix this? And so I went, okay, I'm just going to have the father know this information. It's okay that he knows it. And I had to have another character know the information that this character knew. And it's a challenge. It really is, but it's a challenge I enjoy doing. But boy, I recommend every author trying to do an adaptation of their book into a screenplay. It's a fun journey.
Yeah. So I know you want to get back to your fantasy, right? Yeah. I know you're working on the screenplay.
Yeah.
Is there something in the future? Sometimes I'll call it a goal. Sometimes I call it a wish list. Is there something as a writer that you want to do in the future that maybe it just hasn't been the right time, you haven't had the time for it in general, or something maybe you, again, taking yourself out of your comfort zone and trying something maybe you haven't tried yet?
Well, clearly, first and foremost, the biggest goal I have is making a film, right? Like, wouldn't we all want to see our work in a film? And that's still a long path. Yes, I'm taking baby steps towards it, but boy, if that ever comes to fruition, I would feel like, wow, that is my biggest goal. Yeah. I think I'm somewhat achieving this goal that you're talking about with my current fantasy series. When I wrote Cecilia, I didn't really build the mythical world too deeply. As I went along, I sort of like book 2 and book 3, I'm like, ooh, and I started to build it that way. But after watching Game of Thrones, I read a little bit of book 1, but I had a harder time reading that book. I think George R. R. Martin's a brilliant writer, but I just had a tough time constantly head jumping from chapter to chapter, a different point of view. I need to stay with a particular character. I could maybe have 2 character points of view, but there were just too many for me to keep the connection. But I loved watching the series, and I'm just watching that, and the opening, I'm like, he knew. George R. R. Martin, he knew about these White Walkers. He knew when they came into the world. He knew. He didn't do what I did in Cecilia. He didn't just start kind of making up the mythology as he got deeper and deeper into it. He knew it. Yeah. And I always wanted to. I went, that's what I want to do for my next series. For my next fantasy, my biggest goal is to build this world that has the mythology that's solid, that you know where all the gods come from, and you know how the world was built, and you know what all the different, like, if someone finds something like a scepter, you know where that scepter came from and you know what its powers had. You're not making, as an author, you're not making it up in the moment because you've built that world. I've done that part. I've built the world. It's like a 60-page for my current fantasy that I'm working on. I've got that 60-page world. My biggest dream is to just get the books written. That is it. Because I put so much work into building the world that I was inspired to do by Game of Thrones that I want to get those stories written big time.
Yeah. Definitely looking forward to that because I did love Game of Thrones as well. So definitely looking forward to when you get that going. Again, I really want to thank you for coming on, Sandra. This was great. I mean, the thing I love the most doing this is really getting to meet all you guys, right? Because so many times, it's a message here, a message there. We send something quickly or share each other's work, but you never get to meet the other authors, right? And this is the beauty of this is the viewers meet the person, right? Not just the author, but the person. And that helps build those connections to the readers because now they understand why you wrote it, right? Why you came from it from that angle, why you're on Australia's government's watch list. They understand all these
thing, isn't it?
They understand all these different aspects of what made you and the story, right? And that's the beauty of doing this is really finding out about the person behind the author, right? And I really enjoyed listening to everything and everything you've written and why you wrote it. Just want to let the viewers know again that if you have any comments for either of us, leave them down below. We'd be happy to answer them, or just if you want to say something about the episode or any of our works, that'd be great. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification so you don't miss all these amazing, talented authors that are coming up. And thank you again, Sandra, for coming on. I really did enjoy this.
Adrian, thank you so much for what it is you do, because there's a lot of work you still have to do, editing and doing all this. And as an author, I have no words. Thank you for giving up your time to promote other authors. It's absolutely amazing. And
like I said, I understand how much it means to us and how much work we put into this. So I will always do it for that reason. I really wish that more people would see how talented and how amazing all of us authors are that aren't, everywhere, that the people don't get to see, right? We're not on all the TikTok videos that people are saying, go read this. You don't get caught there. You're not in Target and all the lists. So when people go there to go find it right away, it's about getting eyes on our work. So I will always try to do my best for that, for all of us, because I understand, right? I understand how it is.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me. I had a really fun time. It was great.
So did I. Thank you very much. And thank you, viewers, for watching. Goodbye.